Well, first of all, let me say that I'm really glad to see that this Health and Human Services track here at the OPM Network Conference, because I think this is a very much an underdeveloped and under-researched area. Now, I think that most of you have come here to learn something, and I hope that this will be educational. And I think that this drives home a point that there's a need for OPM in human services. I think that a lot of you have come through this route of being very good at what you do, managing the behavior of children with special situations. And what happens to the really good people? They get promoted, right? And then you have to try to apply those principles to managing staff that often don't have a lot of good benefits, low pay, etc. And as it turns out, as soon as you turn your back, they start doing something completely different, as Ray's data has shown us. So we have a challenge here to face, and Dr. Miltenberger's talk is kind of a tough act to follow because I don't have any reactivity data. So you'll just have to take my word for it that these things are working. No, but in all seriousness, what I'm bringing here to the table, I hope, is what was the last discussion point from Miltenberger's talk, and that was that a lot of the time the interventions are top down, meaning that it's the supervisor who decide what should be the observation schedule, what the intervention should be, etc., etc. And perhaps involving employees in what you're doing, the supervisors, the mid-level managers, and the line workers themselves might have some benefit. So that takes me to my talk called Employee Involvement Behavior Change Initiatives. So first a little bit about how I got here. I got my doctorate from Western Michigan University with Dr. Austin. And John Austin developed the Performance Diagnostic Checklist, which is an informant assessment tool. And it focuses on 4 content domains: antecedents and information, equipment and processes, knowledge and skills, and consequences. So if you think there's a performance problem, you look at these 4 areas to try to figure out where might problems be. And it's an informed assessment in the sense that you talk to the people in the trenches, the people that are doing the job from their perspective. Why are these things not happening as you want to be happening on a reliable rate? I also was exposed to the PICNIC. This is Aubrey Danielson's tool. And when you're observing behavior, you might wonder what are some of the consequences that are maintaining the behavior that you want, what are some of the consequences of maintaining the behaviors that you don't want. And then you analyze them from the perspective of the performer. Don't look at it from the perspective of the organization. Look at it from the perspective of the performer, and you'll find that a lot of the times that the consequences that are maintaining the behavior that you don't want tend to be positive, immediate, and certain, very strong consequences. And you'll find that the consequences that are maintaining the behavior that you want tend to be future and uncertain. Now, another reason why I'm talking about employee involvement and staff involvement is because I did a behavioral safety consultation contract when I was at Western Michigan. And we were trying to institute a system of peer-based observation. So what we talked about was peer-based. So basically, the employees caring about each other's safety. And we would have peer-based observations. And at the end of these peer-based observations, we wanted the employees to share kind of what went well, what didn't go well, what needed improvement, maybe modeling the correct safe behavior, etc. And we were, as consultants, driving this process. And the managers that we needed to get buy-in from to maintain the process, to make sure that these observations were happening, they were always too busy. They were putting out fires and didn't want to get involved. And this is what John Logan told me. So when we need to get the managers involved, because when we leave, this thing will fall apart. So we didn't want to just be consultants and came, showed some improvements, left, and the whole thing fell apart. So this led me to think about a way of integrating behavioral interventions into how the organization does its daily business. And I use the term institutionalization. It's probably not a very good term, because what people mostly think about when they hear about institutionalization? Somebody being locked up and they throw away the key. But I based this on some work by, on the one hand, Terry McSween and Grania Matthews, and then on the other hand by Alice Dickinson. And basically the idea that I had was that we could look at at interventions from the perspective of to what degree do we involve people at all walks of the organization into the interventions. And I came up with these 4 categories of involvement types. One would be involving internal staff in designing the intervention. This could also include number 2, training internal staff in carrying out some components of the intervention. Have an internal system of data collection and an internal system for dispensing consequences. So minimize the role of the consultant in, or as the case may be in many OPM studies, the researcher or the student, in running the study or running the intervention, but rather have the internal staff, whether this be supervisors, managers, line employees, etc., participating in the study, in the interventions. Now, I didn't want to stop there, so I did a bit of a link review, a quantitative link review, and I quoted JOBM articles for presence and absence of these 4 institutional realization variables. And I wanted to link them with different levels of intervention effectiveness. For each study that we looked at, we developed an index of effectiveness. How good was the intervention? And what we found was that as the more that the researcher incorporated these things, involving internal staff in design, training internal staff in carrying out some components of the intervention, they had an internal system for data collection, an internal system for dispensing consequences, the larger the intervention effect. You got more bang for your buck if you actually talk to the employees, said, what do you think about this study? What would you like to see changed? They sought feedback before they intervened, and they involved people in the design and the implementation of the intervention in general. So basically, in the years that I've been kind of trying to establish my own research agenda, and I've come to work with a lot of people in human services, both at Kennedy Creeper and in Shepherd Craft in Maryland. It's kind of been my mission to try to, every time that somebody comes up to me and says, I want to do something, well, I always do something to improve performance in the human service setting. And I say, well, let's try to involve the employees in how these things are developed, how they're implemented. So I urge everybody that I work with to do the PDC and the picnic, that are informant assessments from the point of view of the supervisor and the line employees. And they also preach institutionalization. That means getting input from supervisors and line employees in development and implementation, having internal systems of data collection and internal systems of dispensing consequences if you have a system for dispensing consequences. So I'm going to talk about 3 studies here that I've tried to incorporate these goals to live by, if you will, in my research. And all of them were initiated to some degree by supervisors and or employees. And all involved supervisors and their employees in design and implementation. The first one was improving the appearance of a feeding unit kitchen. The second was improve on-time attendance at staff meetings. And finally, improve discrete trial training implementation. Now, the kitchen study is kind of one of my failures in some respects. I'll talk about a little bit about that. That's why I kind of say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, if you will. So basically what we're hoping to do is to reduce the number of dirty and or out-of-place kitchenware in the feeding unit. This is a pediatric feeding unit. It is important that the unit be clean because they had often had parents coming through the unit and it didn't make them look very good if there were piles of dirty plates not around the sink, or if there were clean but out of place plates and kitchenware stocked up next to the kitchen and the sink. So this was not basically making the unit look good, so they wanted to improve this. So we did the PDC analysis with some folks and found that there were no cascades in the environment and there was no feedback or consequences. There was basically nothing happened if they didn't do what they were supposed to be doing. So surprise, surprise, they didn't do it. Now, we based on this, the fact that there was no feedback, no consequences, and no cascades, we wanted to start with the least intrusive intervention we could come up with. So we decided to have a poster. And the number one thing that I wanted to make sure we didn't do was not being passive-aggressive. We want to get a kind of feel-good factor for what we're doing. So we got feedback from supervisors, tried to use humor, but we didn't go and talk to the line employees themselves because we wanted to run a study. We can't go around showing them things before we start the intervention and face them. So we got feedback from supervisors, tried to use humor, etc. So this is the poster we developed. And this kind of looks like Kathy Griffith, age 60 or so. And he put a bit of a beehive here if you want to. This is kind of what a Baltimore pond looks like if you're familiar with those. So we developed this, trying to be humorous, etc. And these are the data that we got. So on the y-axis here, we have the number of kitchenware items that are clean and out of place or dirty and out of place. And what we see is that they were between like 10, 15, up to 30 dirty kitchen items around the sink, which made it kind of look pretty nasty, quite honestly. When we started using the poster, we saw immediate reductions in those dirty and out of place kitchenwares. We kind of switched the intervention off, got a reversal, etc., etc. So what we saw here reliably was that this intervention was effective, right? But as it turned out, the employees absolutely hated it. And we learned from this that passive aggression really is in the eye of the beholder. So even what we thought was not passive aggression, they certainly did. And what we probably should have done was to involve the employees more. We should have gotten somebody like an informal leader in the organization at the level of line employees. Somebody that's well-liked, somebody that's been working there for a while, because if you get them on board with this, then you probably also have more chance of them being a champion of your intervention if people start voicing problems about what you're doing. So this was one of the lessons that we learned from this. Just reiterated probably the fact that we should have incorporated people at the line level into our intervention. The second study that I want to talk about is improving on-time attendance. And what we did here was there were team leaders that were consistently showing up late for team activities. And we did a picnic analysis, and we found that there were relatively few consequences that were maintaining on-time attendance. If they rarely got any feedback, and they rarely got any corrective feedback. There was maybe some detriment in team efficiency, but that wasn't sufficient enough to warrant them showing up on time. That was based on the picnic. When we did the PDC, we found that there were no job or task aids available. Milton Berger, I'm sure you'll like this, they said actually there is no supervisor present, so why should we do it? There was no feedback or consequence for supervisors, and there was response effort in competing behaviors of coming in on time. There was talk at the water cooler, even just getting up on time in the morning was difficult. Or coming from lunch, there's probably more reinforcing to stay in check with your buddies than come to the unit on time. So we did an intervention. We had daily graph feedback involving group performance. So we collected data on the percentage of team leaders that showed up on time at 9 a.m. and at 1 a.m. after lunch. And they approved of this. They said, okay, that's fine. Let's do this so that there's an email, group email, to everybody who's a group leader, and the supervisor also gets these emails. And we wanted also to set a goal so that if they were 70% of the group leaders were on time for 4 consecutive observations, we would have an incentive. Then we reduced that to 70% on time for 2 consecutive observations. You'll see why we did that when you look at the data. And the incentive was a breakfast party for group leaders. So these were things we all got input on from the group leaders, and they liked this idea. So here we take a look at the data. What we have on the y-axis is the percentage of group leaders attending on time. And it was quite variable, but what you see is that the average was hovering right around 50%. So not very consistent on-time attendance. When we started the intervention, we kind of got this immediate effect that you often see, so that somewhat trails away, and we weren't able to catch that improvement and provide incentives for it. So what happened was that we had 2 good data points, and then 2 not quite as good data points. So we changed the criterion so that we only have to meet the criterion 2 times to the 70% criterion 2 times to get the incentive. And the stars indicate when that happened. But basically introducing this intervention led to a change from about 50% of the employees coming in on time to a little over 70%. Some of the lessons learned from this study was that you shouldn't probably set the bar too high at first. Remember, we preach shaping, use shaping. Maybe there's a kind of luck here. Use shape, start with a small improvement, because then you have an opportunity to reinforce. The second one is be open to adjustments. If it doesn't work the first time, keep at it. The final thing is non-monetary incentives can work just fine. Something appears fairly trivial. A breakfast party, basically we brought bagels and some cookies. That was enough to motivate us, apparently. Finally, improving procedural adherence. This was done in a special education school in Maryland. And we had basically noticed that discrete trials were not being implemented, discrete trial training was not being implemented correctly. And we did the PDC, and we found that on the dimension of antecedents and information, there were no challenging or frequently updated goals for the participants. We found that knowledge and skills was apparently not a concern. So when asked, the employee said, no, we know how to do the discrete trial training, that is not the issue. Then we talked about consequences, and they said there are no consequences for completion, feedback is provided incorrectly, and provided inconsistently, and when it is provided, it's sometimes given by teachers who don't even know how to do it correctly. So you get feedback that is not really reflective of how you should really be doing discrete trial training. So we did an intervention that was composed of graphic and verbal feedback provided before each session by a supervisor. So the supervisor met with the teacher and said, last session you did this and this right, this and this wrong. Next time let's try to get it right and do it better, and good job on those that you did well. We set a goal of 80% compliance, and then we provided an incentive so that for every observation that the employee met the 80% goal, they received a token for a drawing. Basically, it was a lottery. So we did this week. So up to 5 opportunities per participant to earn the lottery token. Now, what we have here on the y-axis is are the percentages of correct behaviors, basically the compliance with discrete training procedures. We have 1 participant, 2 participants, 3 participants. And what you see is that the baseline levels were quite low. This is why I raised my hand to 25 to 50% when Ray asked how often are people doing it right. But this is probably inflated because this was done with a video camera. So we were videotaping these sessions. So what we saw, that basically at baseline, the compliance levels were ranging from 40% up to about 80% for the best of times. When we started the intervention, we got an immediate improvement across these 2 participants, across these 2 teachers, and we tend to think that that probably had to do with there was some task clarification function of the feedback, rather than the motivational aspect. Because if there was a motivational aspect to this, we probably would have seen a more gradual improvement. But the fact that it improved like this for 2 participants, and for this participant, the supervisor told me, actually it didn't really click for this participant until this participant had 2 sessions of feedback. So what this suggests to us is that even though they said they didn't have a problem in terms of knowledge and skills, yes, we know how to implement these procedures. It didn't suggest it, because when we were watching them here, they didn't do it correctly, but there was some task clarification component of the feedback that suggested that resulted in these nice regular improvements. So the lessons we learned from this is probably that we needed some kind of task clarification or training. But what is interesting is that the PDC did not identify this as an area for improvement. And this probably is because the PDC is an informative assessment, and it's not a functional analysis tool. And what we got here was probably erroneous information when we talked to the employees themselves. So what we have here is that the informative assessment should have probably been complemented with some natural observation and with competency testing. Looking at having tests for them, asking them, what do you do in this situation, what do you do in that situation, and try to figure out if there really wasn't a shortcoming in knowledge and skills, because the data certainly suggests that it was. So, based on this kind of journey, I found some words to live by. And I think some of them are, do not assume that something is happening just because you told people to do it. Ray's data suggested, my data suggested. A lot of piles of dirty dishes, 80% to 40% compliance with discrete trial training, half of the people showing up on time. Collect data, collect data, collect data. And if you decide to intervene, use OBM functional assessment tools and involve supervisors and employees in the trenches in assessment and implementation. Thank you so much for your attention.